Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our final first bell lecture of academic year or of calendar year 2022 in our fall semester. It's been a great semester. We've had lectures from Dr. Regina Akers and today's speaker Fred Leiner, as well as a Seapower scuttlebutt with the naval strategist Brian McGrath. We hosted a great third deck workshop for Assistant Professor Abby Mullen working on her new book on the Barbary War, which we'll hear about the Barbary War today. And back in August, we had our first ever McMullen workshop in teaching naval history and Seapower, which was hosted by FINHSS. So I want to thank everybody who's here at the Naval Academy that supports our efforts and all of those online who are watching us as well. I'm Commander B.J. Armstrong. I'm the Principal Associate of the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies, or FINHSS as we call it here in the History Department at the Naval Academy. This is yet again another First Bell lecture in Naval Leadership and History, which is a joint initiative of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership and the FINHSS effort launched by the Naval Academy History Department. The Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership was founded in 1998, and it serves as a resource for midshipmen and the wider Naval Academy community as it aims to empower leaders who make courageous decisions, courageous and ethical decisions. And the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies is an initiative of the History Department at USNA. Now, we founded FINHSS at the start of the academic year 2022 in order to develop our collective understanding of the naval past and to encourage collaboration in the wider field of Seapower studies to help us understand the naval present and naval future. The Stockdale Center and FINHSS would like to thank William C. Stutt, USNA class of 1949, as well as the Naval Academy Foundation for their generous donation that supports the lecture series that we're watching today. So after we hear today's lecture, we'll have a brief period of Q&A with our midshipmen and the faculty that are here in the room with us, and we'll wrap up at 13:20 to make sure all our students can make it to class on time this afternoon. Today we're joined by Mr. Fred Leiner. Fred's a naval historian and a lawyer who works extensively on the history of the U.S. Navy in the first decades of its existence. He is the longtime chair of the Maritime Committee at the Maryland Center of History and Culture, which used to be known as the Maryland Historical Society, and is an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. He's the author of the books Millions for Defense, The Subscription Warships of 1798, as well as The End of Barbary Terror, about the Second Barbary War. Today's lecture is based on his research that he conducted for his new book, Prisoners of the Bashaw, the 19-month captivity of American sailors in Tripoli, which was just released by Westholme Press. Please join me in welcoming Fred Leiner.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up in the back. Okay. My thanks to Commander Armstrong for inviting me here today, and thank you all for coming out. I am the author of Prisoners of the Bashaw, and this is the cover art, of course, and since I didn't have anything to do with it, I hope you enjoy it because I think it's pretty striking. My publisher thought that if you're going to write a book like this and it's in bookstores, people do judge books by their cover. So I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, given the Stockdale Center's mission of military ethics, as well as the First Bell Lecture's focus on naval leadership, I thought I would dispense with a narrative history of the Barbary Wars, figuring that in this audience, you probably all know something about the chronology of what happened between America and the Barbary states in the very early years of the 19th century. Instead, I'm going to organize my talk today around what I will call inflection points that raise military ethical issues, various issues for various people at various times. And then I'm going to invite you during the Q&A afterwards to ask me about it, or perhaps we can actually engage in a discussion about some of these points. So here's the plan for today. To make sure we're all singing from the same hymnal, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the First Barbary War, even though I said it's not going to be a narrative lecture about the war, just to sort of make sure we're all together. I'm going to talk about the grounding of the frigate Philadelphia, which is what this image is, and the imprisonment or actual enslavement of Americans in Tripoli for 19 months. Then I'm going to break it down and talk about the various issues confronting the officers and the men, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, everyone on board? Okay. So first, a little background. And again, this is at the risk of perhaps getting some of the details a little wrong, I just want to give you an overview of what to expect. Okay, from time immemorial, meaning going back centuries, the Barbary regimes along the North African coast, the so-called Maghreb, had engaged in a practice of seizing European seamen and passengers, sometimes launching expeditions to Tuscany and Spain and Ireland, Iceland, if you can believe it, to seize people, bring them back to Barbary, where they would be held for ransom. And until they were ransomed, they were treated as slaves, doing grinding physical labor. And the nature of that slavery is the subject of a lot of academic dispute. I don't want to get to that, except as it relates to the Americans in a few minutes. When the United States became independent from Britain in 1783, of course, American sailors became a target of the Barbary states as well. The largest and most powerful of the Barbary states was Algiers. And in the decade after our independence, Algiers seized more than 100 American seamen, holding them for ransom. They were only freed in 1796 when the Washington administration paid the astronomical amount of $642,000, which doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but it was a lot of money then, to free the survivors, and there were only 85 survivors. Now, as you probably also know, the United States Navy was conceived of to fight the so-called Barbary pirates. So the United States Navy was authorized in 1794 because of the problems with Algiers. The ransoming of the 85 survivors vitiated the need for the Navy. So the Navy was essentially in a hiatus for 2 years until there was the so-called quasi-war against France from 1798 to 1800. This is really history quick. The Barbary Wars began in March 1801 when the Bashaw of Tripoli ordered his janissaries to cut down the flagpole of the US Consuls House. What a symbolic and effective way of showing that you're at war. At the time, interestingly enough, Tripoli held no Americans as captives, but it wanted to have America pay additional tribute, tribute being nothing more than protection money that a country, all the European countries paid, and we paid to each of these regimes along the Maghreb so as to not have our people taken and held for ransom. We paid money in advance, tribute. That wasn't good enough for the Bashaw. He raised his demands. The United States dilly-dallied. We didn't really give a definitive answer. And so he declared war in March of 1801. So the president at the time was Thomas Jefferson. And he sent most of the Navy over in successive squadrons in 1801, 1802, 1803 to deal with the problems posed by Tripoli, essentially to beat down the Bashaw and force him to accept a lower cost of doing business. The Navy's performance in 1801 and 1802 is a subject for another time. It was rather uneven, let's put it that way. The lead ship of the 3rd Squadron in 1803 was the 36-gun frigate Philadelphia, commanded by William Bainbridge. Chris, if you show. So that's an engraving of Bainbridge about 10 years after these events. So let's talk about Bainbridge for a minute because he's the linchpin to a lot of what happened. In 1803, William Bainbridge was only 29 years old. He had gone to sea at age 15 and joined the Navy in 1798 as a lieutenant. Bainbridge had the dubious distinction of having surrendered the first ship ever in US Navy history, the schooner retaliation during the Quasi-War. Then, in 1800, he had another dubious distinction. He anchored his command, the frigate George Washington, under the batteries of Algiers. So the day of Algiers forced him to ship a menagerie of exotic animals and his tribute to the Sultan in Constantinople, which were not in Bainbridge's orders, and off Bainbridge went doing the day's business. It was considered a tremendous embarrassment for the United States. In addition, I should say, Bainbridge had the reputation of being a tyrant over his men. He resorted to floggings more than most Navy captains, and his men hated him, or at least most of them did. His officers, different story. The commodore of that third squadron, the 1803 squadron, was Edward Preble. And from Gibraltar, where the squadron had rendezvoused, he sent the Philadelphia to Tripoli to begin the seasonal blockade. Blockades in those days were essentially seasonal, and during the winter weather with gales, the blockade was lifted and the American squadron sort of fell back to Malta, which had become its base. Chris, the next slide. So this is a famous engraving. I actually talk about this in the book because this image was drawn by a sailor on the Philadelphia, and there's testimony that this is actually quite an accurate rendition of her appearance. So on October 31st, 1803, a little after 11 in the morning, the Philadelphia, which was chasing a Tripolitan cruiser, ran aground on Caliusa Reef, which is 3 or 4 miles off of the port of Tripoli. Strangely, the reef was not marked on any chart. It's quite anomalous because on French charts, it's there. Bainbridge tried to do all sorts of things to get her off the rocks. He pumped the water out of the bilges. He started the fresh water overboard. He had the crew, by main force, bring the guns aft, the cannon, which weigh 2,000 pounds each or more, aft. And then when that didn't work, he had them actually thrown overboard, keeping only a few cannon left on the ship. As a last desperate measure, and this image illustrates it, I think, yes, he had the foremast chopped down, all to try to lighten the ship. But none of these efforts worked. And as in fact, the Tripolitan rallied their gunboats from the port, and originally 3 gunboats and then 9 gunboats took station, as this picture also illustrates, in an area where their fire could not be returned by the few remaining cannon on board the Philadelphia. The gunboats fired high, deliberately aiming for the rigging, but not the hull. They wanted to capture the ship as intact as possible, albeit she was on the rocks. After 4 hours, Bainbridge surrendered the ship and the 307 men, officers and men, on board. So Bainbridge had the dubious distinction of being both the first and the second American naval commander to surrender his ship. And the 307 officers and men went into captivity for 19 months. So here's our first inflection point. The first military ethical issue that I'm going to raise for you. I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to pose it as a question for you. Okay? Bainbridge's decision to surrender the ship. I'm going to try to be as even-handed as I can with this and give you the facts as Bainbridge knew them, and then we can discuss this perhaps later. Here are the points for surrendering as Bainbridge knew them at the time. First, the ship was hopelessly aground. As a last resort, the boatswain suggested kedging the ship, a process by which a ship's anchor would be placed on one of the launches or barges or ship's boats. The boat would move astern of the Philadelphia. They would toss the anchor in, and then men around the capstan by main force would try to pull the Philadelphia backwards off of the reef. Bainbridge refused to do it, saying that the men would be massacred by those gunboats which had taken station. He said, we're not going to do that. Second point in favor of Bainbridge's surrender, the ship had been under attack for at least 4 hours and was unable to bring the few cannon left on board to bear against the gunboats. Bainbridge, in a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, compared himself to a man tied to a stake trying to fend off an armed man. Third, there was no U.S. Navy warship nor a warship of any friendly country known to be anywhere in the vicinity. So if you're waiting for relief, it's just not likely to come. Fourth, Bainbridge called a council of his officers, actually called 2 councils of his officers, and none of them thought that they could defend the ship. They all expected an attack at night that would eventually overwhelm the 307 officers and men, and by resisting, they'd all be annihilated. And indeed, on November 1st, the first day of captivity, the officers all signed a letter supporting Bainbridge's conduct. Fifth, and finally, Bainbridge thought there was only one alternative to surrendering. That was to blow up the ship. But he said, and this is his language, such conduct would not stand acquitted before God or man, and that he had no right to consign 306 other men to their deaths. So he did not. He surrendered. Now here are the points for Bainbridge not surrendering. First, as all of you know, a captain is charged to defend his ship to the utmost. When Bainbridge surrendered the ship, there was not one man killed and not one man wounded on the Philadelphia. Second, according to a Marine private who wrote a very extensive account of these events, the men's blood was up. They wanted to fight. Indeed, one sailor at the halyards, when ordered to lower the colors, absolutely refused Bainbridge's order. And a midshipman did it at Bainbridge's request. Third, and I see some Marine officers in the room, they will appreciate this. Of the 307 officers and men, there were 40 Marines, and the Marines had not yet received the renown that they were later to get, but they were trained marksmen, and the ship had boarding nets that it could have elevated along the mast to make boarding the ship very difficult. So with all the muskets and pistols and pikes and tomahawks and 40 Marines, there is some thought that they could have kept the Tripolitans off for quite a long time, especially because they had no place to retreat, and the Tripolitans may not have been so eager to take on a crew that was really eager to defend the ship. Fourth, and again, people in this audience know this better than I do, I'm at best a weekend sailor, unexpected things can happen at sea. A friendly ship might appear. There might be a gale that blows the Tripolitan gunboats back into harbor. There could even be such a huge gale that the ship is blown off the rocks. Now, none of these seem likely, I suppose, to Bainbridge, but the point is that Bainbridge had some reasons to delay surrendering. In fact, as it happened, within 48 hours, there was a storm that blew the Philadelphia off the rocks. Now, of course, Bainbridge could not have known that. But the point being is that at the time when he did surrender, who knows what eventualities might come up. So here's the question. Did Bainbridge do the right thing in surrendering his ship when he surrendered it? And I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I think it's an interesting question that we can discuss later. So the Philadelphia's officers and crew were manhandled, and they were rowed ashore into captivity. The officers, meaning the commissioned officers and the warrant officers, plus a few stewards, a total of 43 in all, were initially housed in the U.S. Consuls House, and they had a fairly comfortable existence. They had offered their parole, their word of honor, that they wouldn't try to escape in exchange for some basic personal freedoms, like being able to walk around the town. The Bashaw immediately reneged on that deal. In fact, after 2 days of them going up to the roof to look at the city and the Philadelphia on the rocks, the Bashaw ordered them off the roof not clear why, and had the entrance bricked up, so they were sort of left in reasonably comfortable confinement in the Consul House, but nevertheless, that's where they were. They were fed very well, interestingly enough, because of the intercession of the Danish consul, a man named Nikolai Nissen, who should be a real hero to Americans for his conduct towards the captive officers. Anyway, their lives changed remarkably 4 months into their 19-month captivity. Chris, can you show the next slide? This is an image from the Naval Academy Museum of Stephen Decatur. A remarkable incident of American naval history. In February 1804, Decatur led an expedition that came into the harbor of Tripoli at night on board the ketch Intrepid and burned the Philadelphia. 2 weeks later, March 1st, 1804, the Bashaw moved the captive American officers from their rather comfortable Consul House into a dungeon, and I don't use that word lightly, it was a dungeon, below the Bashaw's palace, which was incredibly hot in the summertime, very poor circulation of air, a very uncomfortable, nasty place. He also forbid the Americans from having contact with any of the European consuls, including Nissen, who had befriended them. They were essentially held in very close confinement for the rest of their 15 months in captivity. Now, why did the, actually, Chris, we can show the next slide. So this is a not very realistic image of, this is the ketch Intrepid making its escape. This is a not very accurate, but very dramatic viewing of the burning of the Philadelphia. Now, why did the Bashaw move the officers into that dungeon? In part because he thought that Decatur had ordered Tripolitan sailors who had surrendered to be killed. A few days after the raid, the Bashaw told Bossier, the French consul, about the discovery of the bodies of 3 Tripolitan sailors who had been repeatedly stabbed. In a letter I found in my research, Bossier reported to the French Foreign Minister, Talleyrand, in Paris, quote, "The Bashaw has no doubt that they were massacred after the seizure and then thrown into the sea." In another letter, Mohammed de Guise, the Bashaw's foreign minister, wrote Bainbridge, "How long has it been since nations massacred their prisoners?" Now, we might think that this is all a Tripolitan ruse, but there are 2 little-known accounts of the raid by the U.S. Navy surgeon on the expedition Louis Hierman, Chris. One of which is in the National Archives. Oh, well, it doesn't matter where they are. And Hierman, one of these incidentally is under oath in a sworn affidavit. Lewis certainly suggests that Decatur ordered some of the prisoners killed when it looked like the Tripolitan gunboats in the harbor, alive to the fact that American raiders were in the harbor, were about to mount a counterattack and try to retake the Philadelphia before it could be burned. Now, we can talk about killing prisoners. It happens in many wars. But question 2 for you, is there ever a justification for killing combatants who have surrendered? Does a tactical situation ever justify it? Okay, now we're going to move on. I'm going to talk first about the captivity of the officers, where there are, I think, 3 issues presented, then very briefly the captivity of the men, where I think I'm going to just talk about 2 things. And we're going to do this more in a declarative process. So the Americans knew they weren't going to be freed until they were ransomed, or perhaps until a military expedition would free them. But historically, people could be ransomed by their families or by their friends. Didn't have to be government to government. Many of the Philadelphia's officers came from wealthy families, and one of them, Chris, one of them is James Biddle of the Biddle family of Philadelphia. This is Biddle again in about 1814, 1815. He's wearing captain's epaulets, so it's probably 1815. James Biddle was so well networked, to use our word, networked, that one of his correspondents when he was a prisoner in Barbary was the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. His father, Charles Biddle, was a very wealthy Philadelphia merchant who, when learning that his son was a captive, put lines of credit, made lines of credit available through the British diplomats, through the American diplomats and other places, by which, no question about it, James Biddle could have freed himself using his family's money. But he refused. Matter of fact, all the officers refused. His response was that he would not leave his brother officers until they all could leave when they were freed. At a time when the plague and other really terrible diseases carried off hundreds, thousands of people in Barbary, this was a rather brave action. So the question posed to you is, if your family, God forbid, if you were a prisoner of war and your family had the wherewithal to ransom you and get you out of that situation, would you stay or would you go? Well, I guess, Chris, you can show the next slide. So this is actually the only image I have found that is supposed to be the officers in captivity. I suppose the man standing is Bainbridge in the far distant, looking out the window. This is supposed to be when they're watching one of Preble's gunboat attacks, but again, it's the only image I have. The officers, perhaps surprisingly, were allowed to write, not only write their loved ones at home, but write their friends in the squadron. And Bainbridge used this opportunity to write Preble with all sorts of information, not only about how the captives were doing, but what he could glean about the intel about the fortifications in Tripoli and other matters. Now, how did he do this? Well, he used what he called sympathetic ink, which was lime juice or a very weak solution of carbonic acid that he would interlineate between the actual lines of a letter. He would hand these off to Nissen, and Nissen would make sure that they got delivered via merchant ship or however. Very interesting. Now, when they were put in the dungeon, Bainbridge came up with another way of sending out intel. And that was, he used the same sympathetic ink, but when Nissen would send in books for them to read while in captivity, he would wrap the book with his letter, presumably facing internally, in what today we would call a dust jacket. And to our knowledge, none of these letters were ever intercepted by the Tripolitan regime. Now, substantively, the information he shared with Preble may not have been too important, but that's not the point. The point really is that even in captivity, Bainbridge tried to serve his country and confound its enemies. Chris, I think it's good. So I've never been in Tripoli. I don't advise it as a travel destination. But I understand this is the ruins of the Bashaws Castle, which is now the National Museum of Tripoli. One wonders if the dungeon is a visitor's locale. Now, it was almost impossible for the officers to escape from this dungeon. Why is it impossible? Well, they don't look like their captors. They don't dress like their captors. Very few of them spoke any Arabic or any Turkish. They had no tools to dig. You know, the list goes on and on. If they were to escape, they would presumably have to coordinate it with the squadron offshore, which was obviously very difficult to imagine. But it didn't matter. They tried again and again and again to escape. Now, they had to call off each of the escapes because they were about to be discovered, but they tried. And the point is, despite the odds, as American officers, they found it their duty to try to escape. Now, quickly, let me turn to the 264 sailors and Marines who were fed poorly, who were beaten. What did they do? They were the ones who were so-called mechanics, the coopers and the sailmakers, etc. They were repairing and building gunboats for the Bashaw on the Strand. They had no choice in the matter. The rest were used as pack animals, hauling stone, mixing mortar, building walls. They were beaten. They were housed poorly. I could go on and on. You can read the book if you want the details. How did the men react to being slave laborers? Well, 5 essentially gave up, 5. And they turned to Islam. And I am not an expert on the Islamic faith, but my understanding is that it is against the teachings of the Quran to enslave a fellow Muslim. So by becoming Muslim, they essentially got a get out of jail free card, and they used that. The sailors looked at these people as turncoats. They called them renegades, and they had all sorts of negative phrasing for them. Putting on the turban was an expression. Turning Turk was the common phrase. And they were held in contempt by the majority of the crew. So what did the 259 other people do? I have 2 very quick stories for you. One story, I would love to meet this man. A gunner's mate named Griffith told the Bashaw that he was a gunner's mate. So he said, I know how to heat cannonballs to make them red hot shot, which of course in a day of wooden warships and canvas sails could be very dangerous to if you're on the receiving end. So the Bashaw commissioned him to build a furnace, and Griffith took the Bashaw's money, great length. He built the furnace, and the day came to show off his invention. And when Griffith started to heat up the furnace literally cracked, and the whole thing fell apart. And of course, everyone understood that Griffith never had an intention to build a furnace for the Bashaw. He was toying with them the whole time. That's story number 1. Story number 2, well into their captivity, the men went on strike to protest their rations. Interestingly enough, and I did not know this before researching this book, the word strike, in the sense of industrial action, is thought to have originated in 18th century England when sailors struck the topmasts of their vessels rather than accepting lower wages from the owners. I don't know if that's true, but I would like to believe it's true. Anyway, in 1804, the sailors, all 259 of them, sailors and Marines, went on strike. And the officers came in the morning to roust them out on their work details, and none of them got out of their rudimentary beds, cots. And the overseers or wardens started to beat them, really mercilessly. None of the men broke. And then the overseers got frustrated and said, we're going to call in the soldiers and they're going to shoot you. And that didn't break them either. And so the warden said, well, what do you want us to do? And they said, we want you to go to the Bashaw and improve our rations, which they did and the Bashaw did. And so they got their rations restored. So in their own ways, and these are just 2 of several examples, the men resisted. So besides the 5 men who turned Turk, and 2 who strangely decided when they were ransomed that they were actually French and sought the protection of the French consul, and 7 who died in captivity or immediately afterwards, 250 sailors and Marines ultimately made it home with all of the 43, or whatever it was, officers. And there was some public celebration for the officers, but not much was done for the men. And that's my presentation. I would be glad to answer any questions or engage in a discussion with you about any of these military ethical issues that I've raised. Thank you. Any questions?
So questions or comments, and Fred can just call on you to
Yes.
Sir, about how big was this building they were trapped in?
Well, I've never been there. So in the Consuls House, it was rather spacious. Bainbridge had a room to himself. I believe the officers had a room to themselves, and the midshipmen had a room to themselves, and then there was a common room for food, and it was rather comfortable. I point out in the book that they actually had more room for exercise walking up the piazza of this Consul House than they would have on a quarterdeck of the Philadelphia, and also better rations. Now, once they were in the dungeon, I don't really have a good sense of how big that space was. It was probably something on the order of 30 by 80, 30 by 60, something like that. And it was subdivided into certain rooms, but it was a nasty existence. It's an interesting point, but I don't really have a good answer for you. Yes, sir.
In all your research, any evidence of anybody advocating for being enlisted?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
In all your research
Yes.
of the book, was there any evidence that you came across of anybody advocating for being enlisted? The officers, maybe someone from another consulate, anybody like that?
You know, that's a great question. And one of the, I could get into a long digression here, but the real answer is no. Now, Consul Nissen befriended some of the American sailors. But the officers had a very almost class-based view of this thing. So the successor to Preble in command of the squadron, for instance, was Samuel Barron. And Barron, I thought, in a particularly striking phrase in a letter, encouraged the diplomats to negotiate the ransoming of these Americans, which incidentally was done. They were ransomed for $60,000. And Barron had this phrase that the officers are too important to let them languish, kind of thing. And you know, what happened to the 264 men? Beyond that, the American newspapers gave the names of all of the officers. I mean, they literally listed the officers. No account listed the names of the men. And unfortunately, the men are rather anonymous now. I don't want to get into too much detail about this. I do talk about this a lot in the book. When the ship came home, not the ship, when the crew came home, the former purser on the Philadelphia drew up a crew list. It's in the document collection related to the Barbary Wars. It is really inaccurate. He got so many names wrong, it's unbelievable. And my research showed, this is deviating from your point a bit, but my research showed that one of the reasons why the list is so inaccurate is that so many of the crew did not use their real names. They enlisted under, I think there were 4 John Smiths, which, you know, John Smith may be a common name, but it's not that common. And on and on. And a lot of it, I believe, is because something like 2/3 of the crew were not even American. They were English and Irish, and with a smattering of other European nationalities. But I'm well into a rabbit hole now, which I can go further in, but I don't think it answers your question. Yes, sir?
What would have been the code that would have prevented them from killing the prisoners of war? What would have been the law?
Oh, I am so glad you asked that question. In point of fact, that's the reason why the Americans negotiated a ransom to free them, because they were afraid if push came to shove and too much military pressure was brought on the Bashaw, he would kill the prisoners. He had vowed to do that more than once. And this is the same time that William Eaton was leading the expedition from Egypt, the Battle of Derna, you may be familiar with. And it was considered an existential threat to the Bashaw's regime. And so you had this tension between the Americans getting close, and as they get close, is it more problematic that some of the Americans, or all of them, could be killed, which would be quite a Pyrrhic victory for Eaton to have taken Tripoli, which I don't think would have happened anyway. But if the cost of that would have been the lives of the Americans that they were over there to save. But so the answer to your question is nothing would have prevented the Bashaw from doing that. Yes, sir.
When Bainbridge surrendered the retaliation during the Consuls House,
Yes.
how was that seen? What kind of punishment penalty did he suffer?
None.
None, so that's why he gets command of the Philadelphia.
Well, in between he had the George Washington, and he also had the Essex, and there's a obscure 1802 open letter, which you can, I think, find online now, by a seaman of his on the George Washington named John Ray, R-E-A. Ray excoriates Bainbridge's conduct. Unbelievable in terms of the floggings, flogging concussed people, anyway, on and on. And interestingly enough, the Navy never seems to have investigated Bainbridge. Obviously, because of the surrender of Philadelphia, there was a court of inquiry when the American officers were freed, but that basically extolled his conduct. Everyone wanted to go home.
And we have a USS Bainbridge today.
I hope there are no Bainbridge descendants here. Yes, ma'am.
So, when they were imprisoned, is there any records of any of the officers or enlisted saying, speaking out against his decision to surrender? Because I was thinking,
No.
No, there wasn't.
None.
So I was thinking maybe they were pleased with that, considering the alternative might have been death, but I'm just curious whether it was.
I've seen no account, and a lot of the men were not literate, so it's not likely you would find that. But one of the striking things about this research, aided by the internet, is that so many of the letters written by the officers home were republished in American newspapers, and most historians have never used those before. In all of those letters, I see no indication questioning Bainbridge's decision to surrender. None. So incidentally, I don't want to suggest to you, I guess maybe I did, but I don't really want to suggest to you that that decision was wrong. I wasn't there, you're not there, and it's very difficult to second guess commanding officer when the cannonballs are whizzing overhead. Yes, sir.
So what did the crew do whenever they were moved to the dungeon to keep crew morale up?
They drank a lot. And they really enjoyed their drink because there was no officer patrolling a grog tub that would say, you know, no more kind of thing. They drank a drink distilled from dates that was widely available and cheap. So they drank, they played card games, dice games, really. It was a different time. I think it's fragmentary evidence, so I don't want to put too much stock in this, but I think they probably sang a lot. Now, the officers entertained themselves at the beginning when they were in the Consuls House by staging plays. I even found out the names of the plays that they put on, and I would not spend $1 to see any of those. Yes, sir.
Kind of broad question. In your research, looking at the writings after the fact of some of these officers, some of whom would be abolitionists or from abolitionist families, some of them would be from families that owned slaves, did their time as slaves or as prisoners change their attitudes or force them to reflect on their enslavement?
That is a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. Now, most of these people, again, I can't even talk about the men because with a couple of exceptions, the men did not leave reminiscences but even the officers, you know, I did not research that. And it wouldn't surprise me to find that the Biddle family were abolitionists, but I don't know that for a fact. But you're right, the officers came from up and down the seaboard, and the southern officers, I have no idea. I have no idea. Yes?
You mentioned that the men officers had access to
Now, are you asking about the men or are you asking about the officers?
The officers of the kind of get a feel for it.
All right. So the men would get gratuities sometimes for doing some of these laborious chores, and they would have a few coins. They also, in the middle of their captivity, they finally persuaded the American commanders to give them a daily allowance. Before that, Bainbridge had been absolutely against that, thinking that the men would just drink the money away. And so he didn't want that to happen. So it's a mixed story. I'll talk more if you'd like after we've concluded here.
So we've run out of time. The midshipmen have to get to class, but I want you to join me in thanking Fred for a great talk.
Thank you.